Dear colleagues, honored guests, it gives me great pleasure to follow two leading scholars in Kуліш studies. My presentation today will take you back to the young years of Kуліш, to Kуліš as a young man. It will focus mainly on his student days in Kyiv, on the intellectual currents reaching Ukraine from Western Europe, currents which captivated the mind and the imagination of his close circle of friends, and which subsequently would serve as the foundation for the ideology, for the program of the first political Ukrainian organization, the Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood. It will also show you the source, or at least I will attempt to show you the source of the writer's Europeanness, of which our first presenter spoke today. The academic year of 1840, the time when Kуліш enters the university, was not an ordinary year in the life of this recently established institution of higher learning. In fact, Kуліš happened to be one of the first applicants to be admitted after a dramatic event in the previous year, the closing of the entire university, because the police discovered a radical student group tied to a revolutionary organization led by Szymon Konarski, still a youth, but already a legend. He took part in the Polish Revolution of 1830, and soon thereafter became one of the most energetic activists among the Polish emigres in France, became the right hand of the Italian leader Giuseppe Mazzini in the establishment of Young Poland, and subsequently of Young Europe, of which I will speak today. Stowarzyszenie Ludu Polskiego, in fact, was the cover name for Young Poland on the territories of the Russian Empire and the Austrian Empire. Intensive work to prepare the ground for a revolutionary upheaval in Eastern Europe began in earnest in the second half of the 19th century, in the second half of the 1830s. That is exactly when Young Europe was formed in Switzerland. So to speak, intensive work to prepare a revolution began with the dissemination of a whole series of appeals written by the Polish historian Lelewel, who was the official head of Young Poland in Belgium. In addition to these appeals that were addressed to the population of the various regions of Ukraine and Lithuania, literally thousands of books and pamphlets were dispatched from France. There was a underground Mazzini's library in south of France. From there, these books were sent to the ports of Odessa and Dorpat, and they were meant primarily for young students, young people, but by that was meant young students. This plan was implemented by Konarski with religious precision when he arrives in the Kyiv region in 1836. And thus, when the secret student cell was uncovered at the university in 1838, among the top leaders top 10 leaders who, like Konarski, were to be executed, there were 2 Ukrainian students from the university. One was Aristarch Sosnovsky, a son of a Ukrainian Greek Catholic priest, and the other, Alexander Chorny, a son of a small landowner. He spoke several languages, was fluent, practically fluent in Italian, and of course he was very important for the underground organization. There is very little information about these 2 people in Ukraine. That was printed. You have to go to the archives or look at the Polish sources to find these individuals' first name. So that has been the status of this field in Ukraine until today. In Kyiv, a city with the largest concentration of conspirators, a good number of the rank-and-file members and sympathizers of Young Poland had the good fortune of escaping police detection and thus were able to pass through the screening process at the university. This is attested by the fact that soon after classes were resumed, both Polish and Ukrainian student groups emerged. Grigorij Andruski, who subsequently will become a member of the Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood, observed that at that time the Poles immersed themselves in books and in dreams of restoring their lost statehood. The Ukrainians were engaged in lengthy discussions of the Cossack past and in exploring the treasures of their culture. Only the Russians, besides preparing themselves for the classes, did not appear to have any interest except the billiard. It must have been very boring to be a Russian in Kyiv in those days. Young Kуліш was a member, if not the initiator and leader of the Ukrainian group. He notes in his reminiscences that because of the extreme caution required, his small circle of intimate friends was unable to prepare a formal statute for their organization or a written plan for action for their designated objective, which he calls the salvation work of the people. He and his colleagues had to observe strictly the unwritten rule to be as elusive as air. This is what he writes. In spite of this invisibility, we can catch a glimpse of the unwritten program of the youth circle to which Kуліш gives the name Kyivskaya Molodь from the writer's reminiscences. And I quote, Ukrainian songs and literature of Ukrainian people inspired youthful minds in Kyiv with the salutary thought to raise their nation out of the darkness, which was destroying the well-being and making it impossible for spiritual forces to prevent the decline. The Kyivan youth we are talking about was deeply inspired by Holy Scripture. It was youth of great spiritual purity and was enthusiastic about spreading the gospel of neighborly love. These lines, even though they were written with caution, great caution, betray the group's familiarity with the ideas of Polska Chrystusowa, a religious mystical group founded by Polish emigres, some of whom were close or actually working for Young Poland in Paris, also with the writings of Lomonet as well as an important early work by Giuseppe Mazzini, founder of Young Europe, Fede e Avvenire, Fate and the Future, a work that was originally published in French for purposes of assimilation, a language that practically every educated person at that time spoke, or at least understood. Mazzini's firm belief that every nation ought to be independent was based on his deep conviction that foreign domination inevitably leads to moral degradation of the subject nation because of the erosion of the nation's spiritual values that were secreted in the culture and traditions of the nation. Therefore, it was the responsibility of nationally conscious individuals in each nationality. In Mazzini's terms, he refers to them as the apostles of the people, a term that we also find in Kulish's writing as well, to prevent their countrymen's continuing cultural and moral degradation by recovering the treasures of their nation's past. Through this effort, national consciousness would be reawakened, providing the spiritual nourishment and moral strength needed for an all-embracing upheaval that eventually would result in self-determination or independence of a subjugated nation. In modern terminology, these ideas could be viewed as a nation-building process, but not one, not in the, that would involve deliberate attempt to create a tradition in the sense of the Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm, but rather a conscientious effort to recover or unearth the nation's hidden spiritual wealth. And this is exactly what the young people of Kulish's time were doing. A sterling example of such an apostle of the people, in the Mazzinian sense, would be Taras Shevchenko, and indeed this is how the poet was perceived by his friends in the Brotherhood. Kostomaro expressed this idea masterfully. This is a well-known quotation, but I'll read it anyway. Taras's muse has broken some underground dam, closed by many locks for centuries, buried in the soil, deliberately plowed and cultivated, so that the very memory of the place where this underground stream flows is hidden from the young generation. Taras's muse daringly entered this cleft with an inextinguishable torch and opened up the way for sunlight, fresh air, and human curiosity. Kulish, too, viewed the Ukrainian part in a similar light. A brief quotation. It was Shevchenko who was the first to ask our mute burial mounds what they are. And it was to him alone that they gave their answer, clear as God's word. The similarity of ideas between Young Europe's program and that of the Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood has been observed by a number of historians, among them Zinovy Gurevich in early Soviet Ukraine, and more recently George Lutsky in Canada. Yet perhaps because of the secrecy in which the work of the society has been cloaked, few authors have attempted to look for the conduits through which these ideas were flowing from Western Europe. One such conduit can be detected in Kulish's youth. It involves his encounters with the Polish writer and critic Michał Grabowski, who, according to the police records, was a member of the Stowarzyszenia Ludu Polskiego, and though not arrested, was under close police surveillance. He had to, for 2 years after the uncovering of the Stowarzyszenia, of the organization, he had to report to the police headquarters. But in those days, that is, the Tsar's police was not as yet KGB. So yes, indeed, there were many survivors. Others through whom these ideas could have passed would be Ludwig Jankowski, who was the godson of the Polish poet Bogdan Zaleski, who was in France, and they corresponded, communicated. And also, if I have time, another conduit, as far as Kуліш is concerned, and Kostomarov as well, would be Konstanty Swidzinski, and his contacts would be through Countess Poniatowska, who was the main courier for young Poland. She traveled frequently to France. Now, coming back to Grabowski, young Kуліш describes his visits to the Polish landowner's estate in the most glowing colors, depicting the days spent in Grabowski's company as the happiest period of his youth. During some of those encounters, Kуліš was amazed how tolerant and patient his host had been when he himself, because of still youthful impulsiveness and hot-headedness, occasionally became excessively critical regarding some periods of Polish history. In those days, of course, Kуліš could not have known that Grabowski had ties to the Konarski movement, which, as we have noted earlier, had on its agenda the cultivation and recruitment of Ukrainian youth. At that time, it was for revolution. At this time, well, for something else, but the ground had to be prepared from the intellectual point of view for future attempts of, with that objective in mind. As we can see, the top activists of the Konarski conspiracy may have been executed in 1839. 5 of them were executed, but the ideals of young Europe were not extinguished with the death of the top leaders. The apostles of the people that were left behind continued to perform their missionary work in a quiet, patient way once the storm of arrests and executions has subsided. If one would wish to find a connecting link between the Ukrainian political awakening in Kyiv in the first half of the 1840s, the mentor-student relationship between the Polish writer and the central figure in Ukrainian political renaissance would be a prime example. Other conduits could be discussed, once again, if we have time. The question that begs to be answered, I will mention another conduit, and that is through Dorpat, which had one of the most active cells of the Stowarzyszenia Ludu Polskiego. And the Dorpat group included 2 of Shevchenko's future friends in exile, Bronisław Zaleski and Edward Żeligowski. If I have time, I'll tell you 1 or 2 sentences about Bronisław. The question that begs to be answered is why so little has been discussed on this subject of Western influence in scholarly literature. For Soviet Ukraine, the answer, the explanation is simple. In 1928, a young historian that I already mentioned, Zinovy Gurevich, wrote a study under the title Молода Україна, to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the founding of the Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood. The author, by tracing a connection between the Ukrainian political organization and the Konarsky underground, concluded, and I quote, similarly to its older sister, Young Italy, fighting under the slogan God and the people, our young Ukraine, by declaring the rule of God and the people, ideologically belongs to that bourgeois organization he's writing in the Soviet Union, which is known in history as Young Europe. As we could have anticipated, by 1928, a work stressing ideological ties between Ukraine and Western Europe provoked an immediate response from the Soviet authorities. Shortly after its publication, the young author and his mentor, the well-known historian Matvey Yavorsky, were dispatched or sent to Siberia. And this, of course, had an enormous impact on the Soviet writers that dealt with issues connected to this field. Well, we can understand the scholars who had to work in the late 20s, not to mention the 30s, in the under the Soviet system. It is inexcusable for a Ukrainian historian in Poland, Stefan Kozak, not to investigate the West European or Young Poland connection in his monograph on the Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood, appearing in Warsaw in 1990. While Kozak acknowledges the striking similarity between Mazzini's ideas and those of Cyril Methodius Brotherhood, he dismisses any connection by stating that it was not Young Europe, but rather Konarszczyzna that influenced the Brotherhood's ideology. Obviously, Kozak does not know what was the essence of Konarszczyzna, its intrinsic connection to Mazzini's organization, the fact that Konarsky was chosen both by Mazzini and Lelewel to prepare a revolutionary upheaval on the territories of Ukraine. We should note that in Poland, literature on this subject is very rich and very well documented. It is quite clear that Kozak relied exclusively on research found in Soviet Ukraine, a very dangerous practice, because knowledge of European history, including history of the former Soviet bloc countries, is, and I think our Ukrainian guests and speakers who are present here would agree with that. A glaring example in this regard is the 3-volume meticulously annotated collection of documents under the title the Kirillo-Metodiyevske Tовариство, which appeared like Kozak's monograph in 1990. The introduction completely negates any Western influence on the Brotherhood. Instead, of course, it stresses Russian influences, in particular the Decembrists. It treats Young Poland and Stowarzyszenie as two different organizations. And the editors are puzzled about the Zaleski that was mentioned by Kostomaro during the interrogation. They think it may have been Bronislav, but we know that it was Bohdan Zaleski, the poet from Paris. By the way, they are all Soviet encyclopedias in Russian, and even today, they mention that Bronislav Zaleski participated in the revolution of Polish Revolution of 1830. At that time, Bronislav was 11. So, were the young men in the Brotherhood aware of the Western connection? I'm sure they were. Kulak among them would be the first to acknowledge that fact. He knows more. He is central, he's instrumental in forming the small group of friends that Kуліш established at the university, in transforming them to a political organization. It is because of the awareness of the long history of Ukraine's intellectual ties with Western Europe that Kуліш has made the remark. With its head, Ukraine is in Europe, while with its feet, it is in the East. Thank you.